Please, I beg you, don't do this." The woman was on her knees, her hands trembling as she held onto the dirty trouser of one of the cowherders. Tears ran down her face, mixing with the dust on the ground. Her dress was torn, her breathing ragged. Behind her, flames rose high into the night sky. Her house, her memories, everything she had ever known, swallowed by fire. The man she was begging, the one with a long scar running down his cheek, looked down at her with cold, empty eyes. He spat on the ground beside her and turned to the others. "What should we do with her?" he asked, in a language she didn't understand. The other men laughed. One of them, a tall, bearded man, swung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped closer. "She's useless now," he said in a thick, heavy accent. "Let her go, or don't." The woman turned to run, but before she could take a step, something hard slammed into the back of her head. She crumpled to the ground, the laughter of the men ringing in her ears as everything went black. Delta was once a peaceful village, a place where the land was green, the rivers were full, and families sat outside their homes at night, telling stories under the moon. The people of Delta were farmers, traders, and hunters. They lived simple lives, planting their crops, fishing in the rivers, and raising their children with stories of honor and tradition. No one locked their doors. No one feared the night. Then the cowherders came. At first, they arrived in small numbers, leading their cattle through the village outskirts, looking for fresh pasture. The village elders, believing in kindness, welcomed them. "There is enough land for everyone," they had said. "Let them stay." But the herders were not like the villagers. Their cattle trampled the crops, eating what the farmers had worked so hard to grow. When the villagers complained, the herders only laughed. "Cows must eat," they said. "You can always plant again." Then, things got worse. Fences were broken. Farm animals went missing. At first, the villagers thought it was just bad luck, until they started seeing their stolen goats and chickens being roasted over the herders' campfires. Still, the people of Delta tried to make peace. The village chief, an old man named Mr. Thompson, called a meeting. He sat with the herders under the big baobab tree in the village square. "We must live in peace," he told them. "Your cows need food, but our people need their farms. There must be a way to share the land." The herders only nodded, smiling. They said they understood. But that very night, the first fire was lit. A farmer woke up to find his yam barn burning. The villagers rushed with buckets of water, but the flames swallowed everything. The next morning, when they went to confront the herders, they found footprints leading away from the fire. Hoof prints mixed with human ones. Something was wrong. And deep in their hearts, the people of Delta began to feel the first touch of fear. The first fire wasn't the last. It seemed like every day, something new was burning. A barn, a hut, a field. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, suffocating the peaceful rhythm of Delta. Each time the flames rose, the villagers would rush to put them out. But it felt like they were only chasing shadows, always a step behind. The herders continued to come and go, leading their cattle across the land like they had no care for the damage they left behind. The village elders met again under the baobab tree, their faces drawn with worry. "We cannot keep living like this, mister," Thompson said, his voice shaky with concern. "We've welcomed them as guests, but they're taking more than we can give. The land is ours, and they are taking it from us." He looked around at the other elders, their heads bowed in agreement, but no one knew what to do. They had never dealt with people like this before, people who valued their cattle more than the lives of others. The herders had started to refuse any attempts at discussion. Whenever a farmer went to speak with them, they would only laugh, as though everything was a joke. The villagers were becoming desperate, but they didn't know where to turn. They tried speaking to the herders' leader, a man called Kamal, who wore a tattered hat and carried a large staff. His eyes were always hidden by the shadow of his hat, but his presence was enough to make the villagers uneasy. One evening, after another confrontation between the villagers and the herders, Kamal finally spoke. "You think you can stop us?" he sneered, his voice low and dangerous. "We have the cows, and you have nothing. You can scream and shout all you want, but in the end, the land belongs to the strongest." That night, something terrible happened. One of the herders, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, came into the village at dusk. He had been stealing cattle from one of the farmers, and the farmer caught him in the act. There was a struggle. The herder fought back, and in the chaos, the farmer was killed. The villagers, angry and heartbroken, came together to seek justice. They didn't care what it took. They would not allow one of their own to be killed without consequences. But when they reached the herders' camp, they found no one. The herders had disappeared into the night, leaving only chaos behind. The dead farmer's family was left to mourn, and the villagers were left to wonder, was this just the beginning of something far worse? For the next few days, tensions in Delta reached a boiling point. The elders called for a village meeting. They needed to come up with a plan before the violence escalated further. As the villagers gathered in the square, there was a sense of unease in the air. Everyone knew something had to be done, but no one knew how to fight against a group of people who valued cattle over human life. "We cannot live in fear forever," Mr. Thompson said, standing in front of the crowd. His hands shook as he held a staff for support. "We must stand up for what is ours. We cannot let them take our land, our lives, our dignity." The villagers nodded, but there was fear in their eyes. How could they stand up to the herders when the herders had so much power? It wasn't just cattle they had. The herders had weapons. They were armed, and Delta was not. The villagers had only their farming tools: hoes, axes, and knives. They were strong and determined, but how could they fight against armed bandits? The elders debated long into the night, but the answer was clear. They had to act. There was no turning back. As the days passed, the herders grew bolder. They began to push deeper into the village, taking what they wanted without a second thought. Women were attacked, children were kidnapped, and the crops were trampled under the feet of the cattle. In one of the most terrifying incidents, a group of herders took a woman from her home in the middle of the night. They demanded a ransom from her family, an impossible sum of money that they knew would never be paid. The woman's cries echoed through the village as the herders dragged her away. The villagers had no choice but to watch, helpless, as the woman was taken, knowing they would not be able to get her back. The message was clear. The herders were in control now. That night, John, a young farmer who had lost his younger brother to the herders' violence, gathered a small group of villagers together. They needed to act fast. They needed to find a way to take back their land, and they needed to do it before the herders took more lives. But even as they whispered their plans in the dark, the village felt like it was being suffocated by fear, by uncertainty, and by the growing realization that they were losing everything. The fires had become a nightly ritual. As soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the crackle of flames would fill the air, growing louder with every passing hour. The villagers of Delta had started to sleep with one eye open, wondering which house would be next. It wasn't just the fires anymore. The cowherders had crossed a line. They weren't content with stealing crops or attacking farmers. They wanted to break the spirit of the village. They started kidnapping women. It was a sickening thing to witness. Mothers would wake up in the middle of the night, only to find their daughters gone, taken by the herders in the dark. There were whispers of horrible things happening to the women who were taken, and no one dared speak too loudly about it. One morning, the village awoke to the worst news yet. Esther, the daughter of Mr. Thompson, the village chief, had been taken. The night before, her father had argued with the herders, demanding they stop destroying the crops. Esther had been at home, preparing supper, when the herders came and dragged her away. No one had heard her cries. No one had been able to stop them. The whole village seemed to freeze. The thought of someone so close being taken was unbearable. The village felt cursed. Mr. Thompson, broken by the loss of his only daughter, gathered what little strength he had left. "We will not let this happen to anyone else," he vowed, his voice shaking with rage and fear. The villagers gathered, desperate to find a way to rescue Esther and stop the terror that was spreading like wildfire. But the herders were growing bolder, and Delta was becoming a place of fear rather than peace. The nightmare had truly begun. The days that followed Esther's kidnapping were marked by grief and frustration. The village of Delta, once full of laughter and the hum of daily life, was now silent. Fear hung in the air like smoke, choking the life out of everything. The people had been pushed to the edge, and they were afraid to stand up for themselves. But not John. John was a young farmer, known for his strength and determination. He had watched his family work the land for generations, and now he could see it all slipping away. The thought of his sister being taken, treated like nothing more than a piece of property, made his blood boil. "We can't let them win," he told the small group of villagers who gathered in secret that evening. "If we do nothing, we lose everything. If we don't fight for our land, for our families, we might as well give up now." The group nodded, but there was still hesitation in their eyes. They were farmers, not fighters. They had never faced violence like this before. John stood tall, his fists clenched. "We don't have much, but we have our courage, and we have each other. If we stand together, we can fight back." With those words, something changed. The villagers knew it was true. They might not have weapons, but they had the land, the will, and the drive to protect their homes. They began to make plans, to gather what little they could, axes, knives, whatever they had, to defend themselves. That night, they struck. The herders had set up camp just beyond the village, and while most of the herders slept, John and his group crept through the shadows. They knew the herders were ruthless, but they also knew that if they didn't act now, Esther would be lost forever. They reached the herders' camp, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stand still. The air was thick with tension, and every sound, every twig that snapped underfoot, felt like it could give them away. But there was no turning back now. Suddenly, a shout pierced the night. The herders were awake. A battle broke out. John and his group fought desperately, each person giving their all to protect their village. But the herders were armed with rifles, and the villagers, armed only with farm tools, were no match for them. The fight was brutal. In the chaos, John spotted Esther tied up near the campfire. She was alive, but barely. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. He fought his way through the herders, pushing past the pain and fear, and reached her side. But the battle was far from over. The night after Esther's rescue was not one of celebration, but one of quiet mourning. The battle had been fierce, and though the villagers had managed to free Esther from the herders' camp, the cost had been high. The air was thick with the smell of smoke from the nearby fires, and blood stained the dirt where the villagers had fought to protect their homes. Several villagers lay dead, and many others were wounded, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. John sat beside Esther, watching as she rested on a mat in the village square. Her body was bruised and battered, her clothes torn from the struggle, but her eyes were full of life. She was alive, something they hadn't been certain of just hours before. For that, he was grateful. But it didn't change the fact that their village was in ruins. The herders were not going to stop. They would come again, more angry, more determined. and better armed. As the villagers gathered around the fire, John spoke to the group. His voice was low, but filled with determination. "We can't run anymore. This is our home. We will fight for it. We will fight for our families, for everyone we've lost. This is not just about saving Esther. It's about saving all of us." A murmur of agreement rose from the group. But John could see the fear in their eyes. These were farmers, not soldiers. They didn't know how to fight with weapons, only with their hands and hearts. But John knew that if they were to survive, they had to become something else, something stronger. "We have to make a stand," he said. "We can't wait for the government. They've turned their backs on us. We must defend ourselves. We take the fight to them." The decision was made. The villagers would not wait passively for their enemies to come to them. They would find the herders' stronghold and strike first. It was a risky plan, but it was their only option. John's mind raced as they planned. They needed to act quickly, before the herders could regroup and strike back. Their numbers were fewer, but they had something the herders didn't: the will to protect their homes, their families, their land. The following morning, the villagers, armed with farming tools, knives, and whatever they could find, set out to track the herders. They moved through the forest in silence, each step heavy with the weight of what was ahead. No one spoke of fear. Instead, there was a new fire in their eyes: revenge. They found the herders' camp just as the sun was setting, and they struck hard and fast. The herders had no idea what was coming. It was chaos. The sound of battle filled the night, a sound so raw and wild that it seemed to echo through the trees. The villagers fought fiercely, their desperation and anger driving them forward. In the midst of the chaos, John found himself face to face with Kamal, the leader of the herders. Kamal's face twisted into a cruel grin as he raised his rifle. But John was faster. With a swift movement, he lunged forward and knocked the weapon from Kamal's hand. The two men grappled in the dirt, each trying to overpower the other. "You think you can defeat us?" Kamal spat, his breath heavy with rage. "We are unstoppable!" John's heart pounded in his chest. "Not anymore," he growled. With one final, brutal push, John threw Kamal to the ground and stood over him, breathing heavily. The herder leader's eyes were wide with shock, but John didn't hesitate. He lifted his hand, ready to strike. But something stopped him. He looked down at Kamal, seeing the man not as a monster, but as a man driven by his own fears, his own desires. Kamal had taken everything from them, but John realized in that moment that revenge wouldn't bring back what they had lost. Instead of striking, John took a deep breath, stepping back. "Leave," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Take your cattle and leave. If you don't, we'll kill you. But we won't make the same mistake you did." Kamal looked up at him, his face a mixture of shock and hatred. But without a word, he scrambled to his feet and retreated, gathering his men. The battle was over. The herders had been driven off, for now. But John knew that this was only the beginning. Delta had taken its first stand, and they had tasted victory. But the war was far from over. The village of Delta was quiet for the first time in weeks. The smoke from the fires had settled, and the air was no longer thick with fear. The villagers sat around their homes, weary but proud. They had taken a stand, and they had fought back against the herders who had terrorized their land for so long. John stood at the edge of the village, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His hands were still covered in the dirt and blood from the battle, but his heart was lighter. They had done it. They had driven the herders out, at least for now. But he knew deep down that the peace they had won was fragile. The herders were not easily deterred. They would come back. "Are we safe now?" Esther asked softly, her voice full of uncertainty. She had been through so much: kidnapped, terrified, and now finally free. But the scars of the past few weeks would stay with her for a long time. John turned to her, his expression serious. "Number, we're not safe yet, but we've shown them that we're not afraid, and we're not backing down. We've proven that we can fight for our homes." He knew the truth. The government had failed them. They had called for help, and the militia had never come. The villagers had been forced to take matters into their own hands. And though they had won this battle, John knew that the fight was far from over. The herders would return, and when they did, they would come with even more force. But John wasn't afraid anymore. He had seen the strength in his people. He had seen how, when pushed to the edge, they had fought like lions to protect what was theirs. And now, they were united, stronger than they had ever been. Delta was no longer just a village. It was a community that had learned to stand up for itself. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, the villagers gathered at the edge of the village square. They were tired, but there was a sense of hope in the air, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to rebuild what had been broken. John stood at the front, his eyes scanning the faces of his people. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We've taken the first step, but we can't stop now. We need to stay strong, stay united. The herders will come back, but we will be ready." The villagers nodded, their faces determined. They had lost so much already, but they were not willing to lose any more. "We fight for Delta," John continued. "We fight for our land. We fight for our families. And we will not let anyone take that from us again." As the last light of day faded into night, a new energy filled the air. The villagers knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they were no longer just survivors. They were warriors. And together, they would protect Delta no matter what.